chat, but here is my little bit of a talk on the legacy of Mass Effect from the perspective of mutants and fans to how an industry was changed forever for developers. Mass Effect was, of course, the series of choices, romances, and the chance to destroy the entire galaxy. The original trilogy reached its conclusion in 2012 with the remaster launch just last year to critical acclaim. But the narrative around the series has not always been rosy. The ending to the original trilogy had to be changed after BioWare felt under increasing hostility from its own fanbase. Developers do not get to switch off the lights and go home, of course. The crunch can be as bad after launch as it is in the weeks leading up to release. Because of the nature of the job, developers then are often faced with the ire of fans and needing to tend to their criticisms alongside fixing bugs. BioWare staff in particular were told to get to work to make an ending better, to make something more fun. This, of course, links to Teresa F. Tierney's theory of the networked individual, stating that the networking of individuals over the internet, whether local or international, can empower minority or marginalised groups by providing a forum in which to voice their objectives. Tierney also added that the space is not equal, though. In society structured by inequalities, dominant groups have advantages since they create the rules for public speech and behaviour. As this paper will demonstrate, power transitioned away from developers, but to a certain subsect of fans who argued loudly for the implementation and re-implementation of their desired content. The changes to the Mass Effect Legendary Edition, or else known as the Mass Effect Remaster, which was launched in 2021, reignited the debate once more about just what Mass Effect is in the eyes of fans. But it's not just the ending that came under scrutiny. This paper will specifically look at how this player base has organised and mobilised from the early days of the trilogy to the launch of the remaster, and the impact this has had on the depiction of digitised bodies. Digitised bodies themselves will be looked at for how they are created, for the mutants and mutations and permutations they go through as a result of the perceived and real demands of fans. From genetically mutated perfect characters to customizable avatars, the bodies we inhabit and observe will be documented for the reactions they have elicited and continue to extract from fans and the influence this in turn has on developers. To understand how this power swing was propelled into motion, it's important to remember Terra Nova's point that the digital economy is not made by companies, it is built from the ground up by users, hobbyists, and communities. Users keep a site alive through their labour, the cumulative hours of accessing the site, writing messages, participating in conversations, and sometimes making the jump to collaborators. This is especially true with gaming. Meme sharers, YouTube reviewers, modders, and fanfic writers are key components to all games. According to Lazzarato in 1996, the dichotomy between mental and manual labour, or between material labour and immaterial labour, ignores the changing nature of productivity and productive management. The division between author and audience is transcended within the labour process, and this blurring of lines and borders has accelerated due to emerging new media such as Twitch. If the modders and reviewers, formal and informal, can thrive, there is a chance a game may survive well beyond its initial release. Discourse generates advertisement and keeps a game alive in the wider game community, Sherwin 2019 and Hernandez 2016. The decision to change the end of the game and the unrelenting pressure from fans in the weeks leading up to this was a pivotal moment in game and fan culture history. As Winky stated, no story sequences sparked more think pieces, podcast debates, unlocked message boards threads in recent video game history. What is surprising, though, is how formulaic Mass Effect was and has always been to elicit such a reaction. Mass Effect adheres to Sontag's rules of science fiction films. First, the arrival of the thing, the Reapers, that is witnessed by one person, the hero Shepard. Second, witnesses corroborate the hero's story, such as Ashley and Caden. Third, the suspending of international tensions in lieu of this great threat. Eventually, the case in Mass Effect where centuries-long tensions are resolved in mere hours. Fourth, the unending destruction, and multiple worlds are destroyed. And finally, the testing of a never-before-created weapon that targets the enemy's greatest vulnerability, which we saw with the Catalyst in Mass Effect 3. Conformity did not just stop at the plot. The cinematography of Mass Effect adhered to the sexism of science fiction, a tradition that has dated since the early 20th century of pulps, comics, and eventually films depicting women in a specific sexualized way, according to La Belle 2002. It is an issue that's continually divided the Mass Effect fan base from those empowered to those disempowered and marginalised, with only recent years starting to shift the power dynamics. This paper will argue that Mass Effect's rigid conformity to these science fiction tropes is ultimately what tethered the series to conflict with its own fan base when the series tried to resist its roots for more progressive outcomes. The first demonstration of this will be through the mutant character Miranda Lawson, a character BioWare described as genetically engineered to be perfect. A mutant, as I define, a character created or altered outside the natural reproduction according to or reacting to supremacist ideals. Their ideas of perfection will be examined within the context of the gamic gaze as set forth by Phillips. This paper then will turn to the main protagonist itself, Commander Shepard, as controlled by the players, both singular and as a community entity. The fan-made mutant. Mass Effect sexism reached from character journeys to character design to even cinematography. Mass Effect killed off women, sometimes brutally in the arms of a lover, as a refrigerator mechanic, Simone, to further the rage and stories of male players. The discourse was reignited with the remaster. In the original iteration of the series, the second game featured a character who was genetically engineered to be a perfect woman. In every scene of Miranda Lawson, the game's shot lingers on Miranda's bottom, including during highly emotional scenes where Miranda talks about her kidnapped sister. For the remaster, these images were removed so that Miranda's face and expressions became the focus of her scenes, to the ire of a loud segment of gaming men. The misogyny towards the genetized body provides a unique opportunity to interrogate any harm or influence that permeates wider digital spaces. One consequence of the online criticism of BioWare removing the bookshops was silencing support for the company's editorial decision. Women have always and continue to play games, but they are a marginalised community, as Phillips states, when they do not fall in line with dominant gamer interpretations of video games. Angry gamers took to platforms to condemn BioWare's decision to remove the shots from Miranda's bottom. The commonality of the reactions creates a homogeneous male gamer, one that is portrayed as white cisgender and most definitely straight, the embodiment of traditional masculinity. The concept of shared masculinity, or as I term it, collaborative masculinity, where gaming men can express their individuality, cannot exist under this dominant marginalised paradigm. Women are silenced, but so too are men who do not adhere to the loud clamours for the digitised body to be the property of these men. The reactions ranged from those users who insisted that this was a reason they would not purchase the remaster, to claims modders restoring the content as a victory. Interestingly, it was the same modder that originally removed the butt shots during the first Trilogy era that then restored the shots post-remaster launch. A common strand among the comments was that Miranda, due to her design as a character who was stated to be genetically perfect, players therefore saw her as a fan service character. Linking Miranda's depiction of beauty and the specific shots of her bottom to a service provided for gamers suggests a transaction-based relationship between developer and player. For the player to buy a game, they must in turn be serviced by certain depictions of women. Anything else is to, and I quote, to be fucked with by a powerful corporation, as gamers position themselves as not submissive, but as marginalised in their relationship to wealthy studios and publishers. Phillips defined this gamic gaze as a visual field that gives voyeuristic access to the virtual world, which is then complicated by a recursive set of multisensory input and output that serves to invoke a sense of co-presence and commiseration with the avatar. The non-playable characters serve as titillation for the avatar gamer. To have a leading character who was a woman, she had to cater to a specific audience to circumvent opposition from a potentially hostile consumer base. This was a marketing strategy and one which has evolved continually since 2010. Adrian Shaw examined how Laura Croft, a character similar to Miranda, is a leading sexualized figure, strong and combative, breaking the prior rules for women, which was simply to be damsels in distress. But Lara Croft is a notoriously controversial character for her depiction and what legacy has been left for women. As Shaw said, her class, race, sexuality, and gender presentation were made normative, and thus the only challenge that Lara posed to mainstream game representation was her performance of gendered labour. She could have been kick-ass, a woman of colour, a feminist superstar, but the market logic reigned, and there was an assumption that men could not identify with Laura. And Sherry Grainer Ray describes this as creating a hypersexualized female caricature that's essentially eye candy for male players. While Miranda certainly fits the role of kick-ass through her work as a terrorist, there have been questions about Miranda's feminist legacy due to the way her character was directed and framed throughout the series. The fact that the legacies of women characters are questioned more than the legacies of males shows that the weight of expectation on women. and their digitised, depicted bodies against a backdrop of industry sexism. Yet there are important questions to be asked and answers to be found. She is cool and composed, and without her, the galaxy would lose the war. In so many ways, Miranda had the opportunity to set a new tone for women in games. However, her physical and digitised design was not empowering to her. As Shepard points out in Mass Effect 2, Miranda talked about herself and her looks as though she was a tool to be used. And that's exactly what BioWare did in the original iteration of the games, and leads fans to respond to her as such. As a perfect human, so much of Miranda's character was focused upon eliciting a specific reaction from a certain demographic of players, one of lust. This could be seen as inevitable when in 2015, 2 years after the release of the final installment of the trilogy, the International Games Developers Association found that 75% of game developers are men. A human's perfection, and more significantly a woman's perfection, was left to be defined almost exclusively by men. Project director Mac Walters stated that those shots of Miranda would be removed for the Mass Effect Legendary Edition, acknowledging that I do think a lot of things have evolved since Metro 2021. And yet, despite Walters' comments, gamers took to social media to decry the changes and to assert that BioWare was supporting censorship and giving in to what is pejoratively called woke culture. There were allegations of BioWare being anti-sex, even though the games still have just as many sex scenes. The gamers that BioWare originally tried to appeal to by producing those shots from Miranda have not really changed. Gaming development may still be dominated by men. In 2019, 71% of game developers identified as men, according to IGDA, a mere decrease of 4%. But there is more opportunity to push back against the decisions of white allo cisgender straight men and how they depict women, which is largely dictated by their fantasies and the realities of women and marginalised people, such as gamers pushing for better natural hair textures. Indeed, this is an issue that's persisted since the conception of Lara Croft in the 90s. Referring to the work of Stephen Klein, Nick Dreyer-Witherford, and Greg Depotier, Adrienne Shaw asserted that Lara Croft's design represents a revised approach to game design that more prominently incorporates women into the game world, but in a way that intensifies appeal to the male market. The trajectory starts since Lara Croft has been to make women less overtly cater to the male gaze, rather than to create a radically empowered woman. Miranda's mutant status complies less to ideas about the post-human, but more to current ideas about how women should look and behave. And as Flanagan stated in 2014, the role that the female body plays in the production of feminine identity is significant in the context of patriarchal discourses of femininity that seeks to prescribe only certain body shapes, physical features, and behaviours as desirable. This, of course, extends to which genitals women are assigned in stories, their body shape, their skin colour, or more aptly, their whiteness, and whether even their hair is visible or hidden. It is a burden all women in fiction carry, the axiomatic belief of what makes a woman. They are not their own characters, but defined by their audiences' and creators' perceptions of what a woman should be. Miranda encapsulates this history that they all carry, and she is an example of the pinnacle of these forces. As Compton points out, the male gaze does not give pleasure to the male viewer alone. Hypersexualized women also give female viewers a misrecognition of as a superior body, seeing an ideal in female bodies that is not attainable. These are part of everyday life in the West, accumulating sexist capital regarding suitable looks, dress, and posture, while consumers are simultaneously discouraged from questioning these images through their very normalization. The transactional relationship broken by the removal of the butt shops, gaming men position themselves as marginalized. According to this quote taken from Facebook, upon the release of Mass Effect's remaster, men by this worldview are disempowered if women are not subjugated. The gender gators are in competition, and to empower masculinity is to supplant femininity. Yet games, even single-player action-adventure games, can and do often queer its players. Kennedy again used the example of Croft to show how players are queered by gaming. White heterosexual men were the focus of the game's marketing, and yet those very same players occupied her space, her body, and assumed her as an avatar, essentially a transgender experience. The transhumanist experience of video gameplay incorporates gender play, disrupting and distorting the idea of fixed genders and of the static idea of the male gaze. Through delivering on the base desires of the loudest and most homogenous gamers, they are themselves queered and transformed. Perhaps Mass Effect did not help itself with its own inherent lack of consideration for its women characters. It was clear that even the iteration of FemShep, the playable female version of Commander Shepard, was coded after and based upon the figure of the male Shepard. As Phillips states, this helps to reveal a core belief in women as the second ornamental sex. Miranda is heavily tied to the idea of an ornamental sex. a character whose backstory is that she was genetically designed to be perfect, and the reaction to her and her characters was one of entitlement and control to a digitized body. Wright et al. Stated that Croft exhibits an interesting duality. Physically, she is the embodiment of objectification. She is young and possesses an impossibly large, gravity-defying chest, an inhumanly small waist, and well-rounded hips. On the other hand, she's strong, smart, independent, and in many ways the ultimate feminist hero. Miranda's DNA stemmed from Croft's. Miranda is a leader. She also possesses a large chest, large bottom, yet is incredibly thin with well-rounded hips. She can also run perfectly while carrying weapons and 6-inch boots. It is difficult to imagine a world where a perfect woman would be selected as having a small chest and a well-rounded stomach, instead of well-rounded hips. It is also difficult to imagine the idea of a perfect woman being made to be black, or else simply not white, or that woman not being condemned by audiences. If we take the characters in The Last of Us 2, released in 2020, they were declared ugly for daring to have muscles in a post-apocalyptic zombie world. White, brunette, and conventionally attractive by the standards of European ideals. But all one had muscles and wore clothes not considered feminine, and the other was a lesbian who prioritized strength over makeup. This was enough to elicit anger from gamers. Reaction to the latest Horizon game saw one gamer recreate Aloy with makeup so as to cater to his gamer gaze. What then if Ellie, Abby, or Aloy had been women of colour, transgender? For some gamers, that is an unimaginable prospect, and this audience helps to direct exactly what women we do get to see on our TV and PC screens. Dr. Chris Solomon's used facial recognition software in a study to conduct a survey to discover which features the public found the most desirable. The results suggest that ideas associated with Western beauty dominated, and one key area that was rated as attractive was having a fair complexion. But as journalist Summer Nobel pointed out, the data is questionable when presented as understanding the ideas of beauty if it does not take account the implicit biases that people answering the questions may bring with them, as well as the small sample size. Could a black, fat, disfigured woman be seen as perfect? Not to gamers who already mock Miranda's supposedly wonky teeth. In 2015, Jeff Runer searched throughout the history of gaming and found that only 14 playable women characters at that time, and only 5 of those women could be classified as main protagonists. Miranda's skin colour is designed to appeal to the dominant and even supremacist ideas of beauty for the loudest gamers. Her perfect mutant status reveals the state of hierarchies, oppression and suppression. But making a character that conforms to these ideals, while it does go some way to making us question why they should be considered perfect, ultimately also serves the same people who shared those ideals in the first place. Miranda's a tool made by her father, used by Cerberus, and used by Bioware. There are those male gamers who must make Miranda a victim to fit in with their ideas of femininity. As according to Rebecca Elizabeth Contempt, it may be tempting to see women as an agent of horror, as an empowered feminist icon. However, her empowerment is subversive to existing gender roles, which configure her as a powerless or victim and rely on many sexist beliefs, among them benevolent sexism. This type of sexism is at odds with this kind of monster. Girls are supposed to be protected, not protected against. And so subjugating her digitized body to their own harsh language remakes Miranda as a victim. Miranda is strong, so they must disempower and victimize her to ensure she is broken and to restore their own status. Democratizing video games. Through gaming, as Rehack states, the concepts of avatar and interface become interlinked. Part of what users seek from the computer is a continual response to their own actions, a reflection of personal agency made available on screen for reclamation as surplus pressure, 2003. But because of the persistent ideas that women are less interested in games, despite evidence to the contrary that women make up 41% of the gaming community in the United States, and between 40 to 45% of the Asian gaming community, Yokoi 2021, there is a risk of erasing the different gender experiences of women who game. This section of the paper will thus focus upon the idea of the democratization of Mass Effect. The ability to play as a woman in the Mass Effect series may have been missed by gamers if they did not try the game before 2012. Prior to this, BioWare never suggested that there could be a woman commander in any of their box art. It was only with the release of Mass Effect 3 that this changed. It was a decision that BioWare made the most of in terms of marketing, as they held a vote for fans to decide how femship would look on the box art for Mass Effect 3. The decision to hold a vote over the artwork for FemShep has interesting implications. It essentially risks mirroring the work of Dr. Solomon. The decision to hold a vote at all and the democratization of Shepard puts the power of creation onto the player. The player assumes the role of Victor Frankenstein and the creature. But even this role of mutant creator is limited by biases and BioWare's own construction models. Players did not get a blank slate but were faced with certain features to vote on. As highlighted by Jamie Woodcock, certain character types get far more prominence than others in the games industry. As Woodcock stated, there are far more options for Caucasian characters with limitations of the portrayal of voicing, accent, skin tone, hair types. These are not the kinds of game-based constraints that are fun to experiment with through play. Instead, these are imbued with biases that naturalize some elements within the gameplay, even before the game begins. Of the 6 options that BioWare gave fans to vote on, only 2 were women of colour. Colorism also played a factor, as only one option had dark skin tone, and this was met with derision by fans. There was also little variation with the appearance of FemShep. All had the same body type, and several were nearly identical, except for their hair colour and eyebrow hair thickness, as they were defined by feminine features, makeup, and pointed chins. It is not simply envisioning their own Shepard, but the form of Shepard that the gaming audience will see before they can create their own commander. And fans try to shape this to their own racist and supremacist ideals. The initial creation and representation of FemShep was heavily criticised by game scholar Amanda Phillips in 2020, who claimed she should not exist and could not exist materially. This is because, as Phillips put forward, FemShep was never allowed to occupy her own space, but was simply Manshep's code, copied and altered on a minor level to create a more feminine idea of Shepard. The central idea of Shepard was normative to fit a stereotypical idea of a can-do hero that American audiences would love, rather than being a feminist icon. FemShep was a minor concession that was not acknowledged by her creators until an opportune marketing moment came along to allow other creators, the fans, a voice. And so gamers got to choose out of a very narrow set of options about who FemShep could be. They had been already filtered through a white supremacist, cisgender-focused and sexist system. The vote was given great prominence in the Mass Effect community, as it would allow a woman to occupy space with a man on the front of a beloved game series, and yet there was hardly any choice in the options at all. The cookie-cutter Shepard that fans get through it, though, is responsible for the fate of the Milky Way galaxy. But the default version of Shepard being a man has implications for the idea, again, of the ornamental sex, and the idea of leadership in a society where Shepard becomes akin to a religious leader preaching warnings about the doom of the galaxy and trying to lead civilians to safety and security. As Philip stated, even if FemShep were a complicated, empowered individual woman designed on her own right, rather than a reskinned man, she may not exhibit the best characteristics of a progressive champion. Phillips emphasises that Shepard was modelled according to stereotypical ideas of masculinity, and slight adjustments were made for FemShep. This is not really queering Shepard, and not comparable to players being forced to navigate the world as a specific gender. It is stripping back and erasing the different gender expressions, giving minimal diversity or representation. To conclude, this paper has examined the legacies of Mass Effect as a transactional relationship through the attempts to democratize games. Mass Effect is a unique example as the first major series title to rewrite an ending for the fandom, and the relationship is one of fraught power dynamics in an evolving industry with fans raised with certain expectations created themselves by BioWare. Whether the series can thrive in the future with uncertainties over identity and struggles to balance the consumer relationship remains to be seen and will likely be the focus of the upcoming science fiction series going forward. Thank you.